the whisper that echoed across oceans. In the dim glow of a rain-slicked Parisian bistro, where the clatter of silverware drowned out the sobs of the heartbroken, Etienne Laurent slumped over his untouched escargot, his billionaire facade cracking like the thunder outside. At 62, the man who owned half of France's vineyards wept silently, his tears pooling on the linen tablecloth, unseen by the sycophants who orbited him like vultures, mistaking his silence for arrogance. No one knew the ache in his chest was not from a boardroom betrayal, but from the ghost of his late wife, Elise, whose laughter had once filled their chateau like sunlight. Parlez-moi, mon amour, he murmured in French, his voice a fragile thread in the indifferent din. But the world spoke only English now, and Etienne was adrift, a king without a kingdom, until a soft hand, trembling, unadorned, placed a single, steaming cup of chamomile tea before him, and a whisper, in the purest French of his youth, pierced the storm. C'est la nuit la plus noire que précède l'aube, monsieur. Buvez, et rappelez-vous. L'amour n'est sans vie jamais vraiment. Etienne Laurent had built an empire from the sun-drenched hills of Bordeaux, where rows of Cabernet vines stretched like faithful soldiers under his command. At 25, he was the prodigy who turned family orchards into a global dynasty, his name synonymous with opulence. Champagne flutes clinking in Monaco, superyachts slicing through the Mediterranean. But wealth, he learned too late, was a hollow vintage, tasting of ash when sipped alone. 15 years ago, Elise had been his anchor, a painter with eyes like the Loire Valley at dusk, who saw beyond his tailored suits to the boy orphaned by a factory fire in Lyon. Tu n'y pas seul, Etienne, she'd say, her fingers tracing the scars on his palms from those long-ago blisters. They married under a canopy of blooming jasmine, vowing to fill their world with children who would inherit not just vines, but stories of joy. Then came the accident. A sleek Mercedes on a foggy Provençal road, Elise's laughter cut short by twisted metal and a driver's reckless haste. Etienne buried her in the family plot, the earth swallowing her as surely as grief swallowed him. He poured himself into work, acquiring competitors like a man collecting shields against the void. Boardrooms became his battlefield, where executives bowed and whispered of his ruthless genius, mistaking his detachment for disdain. The Wolf of Bordeaux, they called him in hushed tones, blind to the nights he wandered his empty chateau, clutching her unfinished canvas, a swirl of blues depicting a couple dancing in the rain. By 2025, Etienne's isolation had calcified into a quiet despair. He fled Paris for New York, seeking anonymity in the city's relentless pulse. But even there, his face graced Forbes covers, drawing sycophants who praised his latest acquisition, a chain of organic farms, as visionary, never asking why a man with billions bought soil he could never till. He checked into the plaza, its opulence a mocking echo of home, and one drizzly October evening, hunger drove him not to a Michelin-starred haven, but to a nondescript diner in Greenwich Village. Le Petit Coin, a faded slice of France wedged between a falafel stand and a laundromat. The bell above the door tinkled like a distant memory as Etienne entered, his Burberry coat shedding rain like unspoken regrets. The place smelled of croissants baked too long and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. A handful of patrons hunched over formica tables, tired nurses trading shifts, a grizzled artist sketching ghosts on napkins, none glancing up at the newcomer who ordered in flawless English, his accent a velvet blade. Just black coffee, he said to the counter, his voice flat as the Atlantic. Behind the register stood Marie Duval, 28, and as unassuming as the diner's chipped mugs. Shy to the point of invisibility, she had crossed the ocean from a crumbling village in Normandy 5 years prior, fleeing the abandonment that had hollowed her out like a spent oyster shell. Her mother, a seamstress with hands ruined by rheumatoid arthritis, had whispered, "Va, ma petite. America is where dreams don't drown," before the cancer claimed her, leaving Marie with a suitcase of regrets and a heart stitched with loss. Poverty had followed her like a shadow. She juggled double shifts at Le Petit Coin, her tips barely covering the rent on a walk-up where roaches danced symphonies on the walls. Socially, she was a wisp. Friends evaporated like morning mist, her shyness a fortress built from childhood taunts. La Muette de la Mer. They'd called her, for the stutter that seized her tongue when eyes turned her way. Yet Marie noticed what others missed. As Etienne settled into a corner booth, his shoulders sagged not with fatigue, but with the weight of worlds unseen. She watched him stare at the menu, his fingers tracing invisible patterns, perhaps the curve of a loved one's name. When his coffee arrived, cold and bitter, she hesitated, her pulse a frantic drum. Then, on impulse, she brewed a fresh pot of chamomile, the herb's gentle steam a balm from her grandmother's garden. Approaching his table, she felt the familiar knot in her throat, but something in his eyes, haunted, like the fog over Mont Saint-Michel, urged her forward. "Excusez-moi, monsieur," she whispered in French, her voice a feather-light lilt, placing the cup before him. "C'est la nuit la plus, noir capricide l'aube. Buvez, et rappelez-vous. L'amour n'est sen vie jamais vraiment." The words, an old proverb from her mother's lips, slipped out unbidden, her stutter silenced by the shared tongue of sorrow. Etienne froze, the steam rising like a veil lifting. For the first time in years, someone had spoken to him not as Monsieur Laurent, but as a man adrift. His eyes met hers, wide, hazel pools reflecting her own quiet storms, and he nodded, sipping slowly. "Merci, mademoiselle. Comment saviez-vous? How did you know?" She blushed, retreating to the counter, but the seed was planted. Over the next hour, as rain lashed the windows, he lingered, and she found herself drawn back, refilling his cup, sharing snippets in French about Normandy's wild coasts, where waves crashed like unanswered prayers. He spoke haltingly of Bordeaux's golden summers, of a love lost to the road. No grand gestures, just words weaving a fragile bridge. As closing time neared, Etienne left a tip that could have paid her rent for months, slipped quietly into the register, and signed. But it was her whisper that lingered, a spark in his chest, reminding him that kindness was the rarest vintage, uncorked not by gold, but by the courage to see another's shadow. Marie watched him vanish into the night, her hands trembling as she pocketed the cash. For the first time since her mother's grave, hope flickered, not a blaze, but a candle against the dark. Little did she know, the wolf of Bordeaux had found his first true howl. Weeks blurred into a tentative rhythm for Etienne, the diner's pull as inexorable as the tide. He returned not for the coffee, lackluster by French standards, but for the sanctuary of Marie's presence, a quiet harbor in New York's storm. His days remained a whirlwind. Teleconferences with vineyard managers in Napa, galas where socialites draped themselves like garlands, cooing over his latest philanthropic facade, a foundation for sustainable farming that masked his deeper ache. "You're changing the world, Etienne," they'd say, clinking glasses, oblivious to how the world had shattered him. Isolation gnawed deeper. He'd fire assistance for the slightest perceived betrayal, echoing the abandonment of his youth, when his parents' factory blaze left him foster-bound, passed like a faulty vintage. Yet Le Petit Coin became his confessional. Marie, with her unpolished grace, listened without judgment. Her own struggles unfolded in fragments. The eviction notice taped to her door after a brutal winter, the grief that choked her at night, dreaming of her mother's frail hand waving goodbye from the dock at Le Havre. "J'ai peur d'être oubliée," she'd confess one evening, her stutter surfacing like sea foam as she wiped down tables. "I'm afraid of being forgotten." Poverty pressed harder. A slipped disc from hauling trays forced her to skip shifts, bills piling like autumn leaves. Friends? A myth. Her shyness walled her in, turning potential allies into distant silhouettes. Etienne's acts of kindness began small, untraceable. A bouquet of Normandy wildflowers left on the counter, labeled only "Pour la dame qui parle aux âmes." For the lady who speaks to souls. He learned her schedule, timing visits to coincide with slow hours, sharing stories of Elisa's canvases, how she'd paint storms to capture their fury and calm. In return, Marie taught him resilience, how she'd sewn her own apron from thrift store scraps, stitching in hidden pockets for dreams scribbled on napkins, poems in French about waves reclaiming lost shores. One night, as snow dusted the streets, she found him there early, head in hands, fresh from a boardroom coup where he'd ousted a rival, only to feel the victory sour like vinegar. "Tu es si que tu ringes, Etienne?" she asked softly, sliding into the booth opposite him, a breach of diner etiquette, born of instinct. What eats at you? He looked up, surprised by his own candor. La solitude. J. Tout. E.T. Rain. The loneliness. I have everything, and nothing. In that vulnerability, he confessed the full weight. How grief had armored him, turning empathy into a liability. Les Jin's voyant l'argent, Paul home. People see the money, not the man. Moved, Marie reached across, her calloused fingers brushing his. A spark that jolted them both. Mais tu es plus KCA. Tu es le garçon que survécu au feu. L'homme que pleure pour essayer bien-aimé. Et moi, je suis la fille que traverse les oceans pour un murmure d'espoir. But you are more than that. The words unlocked something. She shared her own full circle of loss, how her mother's final gift, a locket with a pressed violet, reminded her that love echoed eternally. That whisper evolved into a pact. Etienne, drawing on his resources, anonymously paid her medical bills through a community fund, framing it as diner patronage. But Marie's true generosity bloomed unexpectedly. Discovering his foundation's oversight of small farmers like her village kin, she urged him, in fervent French, to pivot. Utilize ta puissance pour les invisibles, pas les rois. Use your power for the invisible, not the kings. Touched, he restructured the board, funneling millions to Normandy co-ops, revitalizing her hometown's struggling fields. News trickled back, families rehomed, her old neighbors toasting the ghost investor from across the sea. The full circle came on a crisp December dawn. Marie, facing final eviction, arrived to find Le Petit Coin shuttered, a for sale sign mocking her. Despair clawed. She'd pack her suitcase again, adrift. But Etienne waited outside, not in a limo, but a rented Fiat, keys in hand. C'est à toi maintenant, he said, eyes shining. It's yours now. He'd bought the diner outright, deeding it to her, not as charity, but partnership. Parce que tu aimes rappeler comment voir. Because you reminded me how to see. Tears streamed as they embraced, the snow swirling like confetti from forgotten festivals. In that moment, struggles yielded to hope. Etienne, once the misunderstood wolf, found his pack in her quiet strength. Marie, the shy whisperer, claimed her voice in the world's clamor. Their connection deepened, not romance, but a profound kinship, vines intertwining across oceans. He returned to Bordeaux changed, inviting her for a summer visit, where they'd walk the rows together, planting not grapes, but seeds of shared healing. As cherry blossoms fell that spring, Etienne stood in his chateau garden, Elise's canvas restored beside him. Marie's latest letter arrived, scented with sea salt. L'aube arrive toujours, mon ami. Dawn always comes, my friend. For the first time, he believed it. In a world that often measures worth by wealth and words by volume, let us remember that the deepest connections are forged in the silent language of kindness, where a single, empathetic gesture can mend the fractures of isolation, turning strangers into lifelines and grief into graceful growth. Celebrate empathy as the true currency of humanity, love as the eternal vintage that never sours, and every soul as worthy of being truly seen. Moral of the story. In the quiet symphony of human hearts, a whisper of kindness can unravel the heaviest solitude, proving that true understanding blooms not from grand fortunes, but from the gentle courage to simply see and soothe another's unseen storm.